what it looks like. This is what it looks like inside the Saturn V during takeoff. There's the command module. There's the service module. And in the S4B is the lunar module stored for extraction by rendezvous and docking in orbit. And of course, that's the escape tower. Right, so here's what it looks like, some pictures. That's up in the upper left-hand corner is the lunar module stored inside that Saturn IVB. In the upper right-hand corner is the command service module. And right here, you see that little pin that goes in that little hole, and they extract it. The booster continues on towards the sun. And this is what it looks like, basically joined together. This is called a stand-up EVA, where they just open the hatch and stand up. And he's looking up. This is the lunar module here. Somebody in the lunar module is taking his picture while he's taking a picture up. And this is the lunar module in the lower right corner in full flight. That's what it looks like. That's what goes down to the surface of the moon. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about Apollo going to the moon. These are the spacecraft, the rocket, the spacecraft, the various elements that make it up. Well, we know about the astronauts, but there were some heroes in the ground, in ground operations, well known within the community, if you will, of the astronauts in spaceflight. And one of the best known was Gunther Wendt. Gunther Wendt was at the Kennedy Space Center. He was the pad leader for all of the Mercury, Gemini, and manned Apollo launches. And he was the pad leader for all of Mercury and Gemini. When Gemini ended, and there was a contract renegotiation, North American Rockwell won the contract for pad operations, for launch pad operations. Gunther, who worked for McDonnell Aircraft, was therefore taken off the pad. Well, the astronauts considered him sort of a good luck charm, especially Wally Schirra. And Wally Schirra went to NASA and the contractors and said, this is not going to work. They brought pressure to bear, and McDonnell Douglas let Gunther go, and North American Rockwell hired him, and he went back to being the pad leader when North American Rockwell for all of the Apollo manned launches. A very famous guy, many young engineers who went on to his pad. He's the last person to touch the astronauts, buckle them in their seats, and then give the okay to mission control that they're ready to launch as far as the pad operations are concerned. And many a young engineer went to the launch complex with brilliant ideas and found out who really ran the pad. Gunther Wendt was famous for sayings like, I see no reason why we should have a problem here as long as we do it my way. And there's Wally Schirra in Apollo 7 with Gunther after he'd been sent, rehired by Rockwell and made the pad leader there. And here he is with Apollo 11. Very well known, very well respected individual down at the Space Center. So there are a lot of people who played very integral parts that never made it to the cover of Life magazine. Well, Apollo 7 was the first manned launch of the Apollo program in October of 1968. The first time the U.S. had launched a three-man capsule. They were the first ones to launch a manned Saturn IB. You hear a lot of different names for the Saturn rocket, and the reason is the only time you needed a Saturn V is when you were going to the moon. Otherwise, it's way too big to go to low Earth orbit, unless you were doing some kind of a test. So you would take that out, and it became a different name Saturn. It became a Saturn IB. And the third stage was the Saturn IVB. So you hear all different kinds of names. It depends on the configuration of the rocket and where it was going. But they're all parts of the Saturn. They tested the new command module and service module. You can see up here in their patch, there they are flying around testing that. And they were the last manned flight from, at that time, 1968, Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. Remember that naming convention? From 63 to 73, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station was Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. And they were the first to do a televised broadcast direct from space. Now some of you are going to say, wait a second, what about Gordon Cooper back in Mercury? He televised, but he televised slow scan TV down to mission control, and they had to clean it up and rebroadcast. This was the first direct, right out to commercial broadcast TV. A 10-day mission brought us to Apollo 8. Now the story of Apollo 8 is interesting. We're now in December of 1968. Apollo 8 was supposed to test the lunar lander. in Earth orbit. Separate from the command service, extract it, separate from the command service module, fly around a bit, and bring it back to make sure all that stuff worked in Earth orbit. But the lunar lander was not ready. Everything else was ready, but not the lunar lander. They were wondering what to do until they got the word from intelligence sources that the Soviets were planning to do a circumnavigation of the moon. Either with dogs or people, they weren't sure, but they had received word that the Soviets were going to do a circumnavigation of the moon before the end of the year. Well, this was still the space race. And so a decision was made, since everything was ready, to send Apollo 8 to the moon. And they went to the moon. They were the first manned Saturn V launch of a full-up Saturn V. Remember, if they're going to the moon, you need a full-up Saturn V. First to leave Earth orbit. Of course, the first to go to the moon, circumvent the moon, the first people to see the dark side of the moon directly and come on back to Earth. Now, on their way back, Jim Lovell was doing some navigation work and he erased the memory, the navigation memory of the computer. Oops. And the capsule no longer knew where